Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to talk about Rect transforms and anchors. Rect transforms control the position, rotation and the scaling of your UI elements in the scene. When you are designing your UI in Unity, you will in most of the cases design it as at a standard resolution like 1024 into 768. But when your game is deployed to a device, the screen resolution may vary a lot from your standard screen resolution of your on your development computer. So this results in rescaling, repositioning, and a lot of movement happens compared to how your UI element was placed during development. This can result in your UI looking very disorganized and not as you intended when you were developing your UI. For this problem, we have anchors. Anchors control how a UI is going to respond to the rescaling or resizing of your game screen on different devices. For demonstration purpose, I have a canvas with the render mode of screen space overlay. I have a I have an image background of the size 400 into 400, and inside that background I have a foreground image. Every UI element in your scene will have a rect transform component attached to it. Even the canvas has a rect transform component. And in the rect transform component, you can get and control informations like the position of your UI element, its rotation scale, its pivot relative position, and the anchors. We are going to cover anchors and pivot in a short while. Now, to control any UI element in the scene view or to change its rect transform, it is best to go into the rect transform editing mode, which you can go by either clicking here or by pressing the button T. So the W is your normal movement transform to change the normal transform of any 3D object, and the T is your rect mode, which is used to uh, change the rect transform of a UI element. So by pressing T, you can either resize the UI element, you can either move it in two directions at once by clicking on this blue circle here. You can move the UI element inside your canvas by clicking anywhere inside the UI and then click and dragging it inside your canvas. You can rotate this UI element by moving your mouse slightly away from the blue circle. Then you can rotate it. One thing to note here is that the rotation of any UI element depends on its pivot position. The pivot position is the blue circle, the blue donut shape that you see in the center of the UI element. You can click and move it inside your UI, inside anywhere inside your UI elements. You can even move it outside your UI element. This pivot is exactly like the center of a 3D object. So if the pivot is outside the UI element, and now if I'm going to rotate it, it will rotate by keeping that pivot as the center of the axis. And the pivot position can be manipulated inside the rect transform by directly pressing X and Y, where X and Y represents uh, the normalized value with relation to the UI element. So if this is your UI element, its bottom left corner would be 0 0 and the top right corner would be 1 1. So if I change the x value of my pivot from 0 to 0.2, it will move in this direction, the horizontal axis of my UI elements. Let's give it 0 rotation. Now if I come to my pivot, I can change the x to move the pivot in the horizontal direction relative to my UI element, and if I change the y value of the pivot, it will go in the vertical direction. So the default value is zero point 0.5 and zero point 0.5, and the pivot acts as the center of your UI element. You can rotate a UI element by using the XYZ value in the rotation field, but it is advised to just rotate the UI element using the Z value so that the UI element still remains in the canvas plane. Likewise, you can change the scale of the UI element to change its size in X, Y, or Z uh, Z direction. But here also it is advised to change the size of your UI element by directly changing the width and height of the UI element, and not by changing the scale of the UI element, so that you don't have problem when screen scaling happens on the devices. Now coming to anchors. Anchors are used to define the relation between a rect transform and its parent rect transform. So every rect transform is, in one way or another, is anchored to its parent rect transform, and the position of the anchors and the pivot control how a child rect transform will behave when the parent is rescaled or resized. Now there are two methods of controlling the position of the anchors. You can see the anchors in your scene view, which are denoted by these four triangles, which are currently at the center of my UI elements. You can click on these triangles and directly drag them to change the position of the anchors. And one thing to note here is that these anchors must remain inside the parent rect transform, so they can only go up till here. And you can also set these anchors by changing the values here inside your rect transform, and the values here represent the normalized value relative to your parent rect transform. Just like we saw in the case of pivot, the values 0.5 in x and 0.5 in y represented the normalized value relative to this UI element. So in horizontal axis, the value ranged from 0 at the bottom left, and the top right was 1 1. Similar to that, when you are setting up anchor, your your this position at the bottom left would be 0 0, and this position would be 1 1. Using those values, you can set the anchor at any position, all these four anchors at any position with respect to your parent rect transform. Now these anchors will always be placed at the same relative position as you have set at the start of the scene. So in this case, I have set the anchors at 0.2, 0.2, and this value is 0.8 and 0.8. So now if I'm going to change the size of the background image, or which is the parent image of my this UI element, the relative position of the anchors would always remain the same. So if this length is now only 200, then still my anchor would be placed at 0.2 or 20% of the new UI element size. So this way the anchor's relative position is always conserved when you are either moving or scaling the parent rect transform. In the case in which all the anchors are separated from each other, the relative distance between the anchor and the edges of my UI elements is also fixed. This value you can see in the rect transform left, top, right, and bottom values. So your rect transform is also contextual, and its values will change depending on how your anchors are placed with respect to your parent rect transform. So when the anchors are all separated, the rect transform will show you the values of left, top, right, and bottom, and each of these values represent, imagine a rectangle with its edges on your anchors, and the distance between your top edge and the top edge of the rectangle gives you the left value, and similar to all the other edges. So now if I reduce my left value, you can see the my UI moves, and you can see the left value changing from 70 to 42. And in this case, if I am going to resize my parent rect transform, Unity will try to conserve those values 70 70 and all those four values are 70, and using those values your UI will be either scaled down or scaled up and scaled differently in all the directions depending on how your parent is scaled. Expanding on that rule, we can take our anchors and move it up to the edge of our parent rect transform. And in this case, the difference between the top of our rect transform and top of our GUI element will will always remain same. And now if we are going to resize our background rect transform, we can see that this border surrounding our UI element is always of a fixed color. So this will give you a nice effect where your UI element changes, the size of your UI element changes, but the area surrounding it from its parent will always remain of the same size. Another interesting configuration is moving your anchors right up to the edge of your UI elements. So for example, if I moved all the anchors to the UI elements, now if I'm going to scale the parent, you can see that the child rect transform is also scaled exactly how I am scaling my the parent rect transform. So in this configuration, the relative size of the child is same remains the same even if you scale the parent rect transform. The last rule of anchors are that if I'm going to bring two anchors on the same line, either in the horizontal direction or in the vertical direction, then the anchors will restrict scaling only in that direction. So here I have restricted those anchors in the horizontal direction. Now if I'm going to scale the parent, the child can only scale in the horizontal direction. If you scale the parent in vertical direction, the height of my child will always remain the same. So you are restricting the scaling in either horizontal or vertical direction. All of these rules combined with how you position your pivot can give you any desired result which you want for scaling of your UI elements, and it will cover most of the cases in which your UI is going to be deployed, and it will cover most of the screen resolution, and you can even extend it to function when your screen orientation changes. But Unity has made our life easier by giving us some presets of these anchor and pivot positions. So you can click on this icon here inside your rect transform, and it will give you a set of preset anchors and pivots, and you can choose anyone that you like. So the default preset is the case in which all the anchors are grouped together in the center and the pivot is at the center. In this configuration, when your parent changes, your UI element, your child's position will only be affected. It will not be scaled. So your child's size will always remain the same. Next important set of presets are your these 8 presets which fix your UI element to any of the edges or to the corner of your parent rect transform. So if example, if I'm using this preset, my image would be fixed to this corner, and when I am scaling my parent UI, it will always remain at that corner. You may have noticed in the this preset window that we can press shift to also set the pivot of our UI element, and we can use alt to also set the position. So if my so previously my UI element was at the center. When I'm going to choose a given preset, I will click on it. I will also shift click and alt click three of them at the same time, and from there I can fine tune and fine place my UI element. Another set of presets are your stretch presets, with the help of which you can stretch your UI element with your parent so that they always remain at the same position, and their horizontal or vertical stretch can be done with the parent. So if I use the horizontal stretch preset here, and likewise I am using the shift alt and the click all at the same time. And now my this UI element has been placed at the bottom. It is set to the bottom edge of my parent, and it is also set to stretch whenever the parent is stretched. So now if I go to the parent and change its scale in the horizontal direction, my image, my the child will always stretch together with the parent. But if I stretch the parent in the vertical direction, you can see that there is no stretching to the child. With the help of these anchor presets, you can have a great control over your UI elements, and you can control how these UI elements look on different screen sizes, different orientation, and on different devices for which the UI may not have been made for. So for example, if you have a UI layout for a landscape view, but if it is played on a portrait view, your UI may change, and these anchors help you to envisage how that changes may look and how your UI will respond to those changes.